It was a chilly autumn night, and I was driving back home from a late shift at work. The road was deserted, illuminated only by my headlights cutting through the darkness. I had driven this route countless times, but tonight, something felt different. An unsettling silence filled the car, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes your skin prickle. I was about halfway home when I noticed a figure on the side of the road, thumb extended. Hitchhikers were rare around here, especially at this hour. Against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over. The man was tall and gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely off his frame. He got in without a word, and I felt a chill as he settled into the passenger seat. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to break the ice. He turned his head slowly towards me, his eyes shadowed and unreadable. "Just down the road," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. We drove in silence for a few miles, the tension in the car growing thicker with each passing moment. I glanced at him occasionally, but he stared straight ahead, his expression vacant. I was about to ask him more about where he was going when he suddenly spoke. "Do you believe in ghosts?" he asked, his voice sending a shiver down my spine. "I guess so," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Why do you ask?" "Because," he said, turning to face me fully, his eyes now piercing and intense, "I am one." I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The car screeched to a halt, and I turned to look at him, but the passenger seat was empty. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing. I looked around, hoping to see some sign that it had all been a hallucination, but there was nothing. No sign of a man, no indication that anyone had been in the car at all. I finally pulled myself together and continued my drive home, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. When I arrived, I was still shaken, but I tried to push the experience out of my mind. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. A few days later, I overheard some coworkers talking about a local legend. They spoke of a hitchhiker who had died on that very stretch of road years ago. According to the story, he appears to drivers late at night, seeking a ride that will never take him where he needs to go. My blood ran cold as I listened, realizing that I had encountered the phantom hitchhiker. To this day, I avoid that road at night, the memory of that eerie encounter etched permanently in my mind. Whenever I drive past that spot, I can't help but glance at the side of the road, half expecting to see that ghostly figure standing there, waiting for his next ride. Driving through the dense forest at night always gave me the creeps, but I had no choice. My parents lived in a remote cabin, and visiting them meant navigating miles of winding, unlit roads. That night, the fog was especially thick, turning the world beyond my headlights into an impenetrable wall of gray. I kept my eyes on the road, my grip tight on the steering wheel. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent sentinels. My car's radio had lost signal miles back, leaving me alone with the soft hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves. About halfway through the journey, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. Standing at the edge of the road was a young woman, her white dress glowing eerily in the headlights. She raised her hand in a silent plea for help. I slowed down, my rational mind screaming at me to keep driving, but my conscience wouldn't let me leave her there. I rolled down the window slightly. "Do you need help?" I called out. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear. Please, can you take me to the nearest town? I hesitated, every horror movie I'd ever seen flashing through my mind, but eventually, I unlocked the door. She climbed in, and I noticed she was shivering, though the car was warm. Thank you, she said softly, staring straight ahead. We drove in silence for a while, the fog pressing in closer. I tried to make small talk, but she responded with only brief, clipped answers. Something about her was unsettling, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As we approached a particularly dark stretch of road, she finally spoke more than a few words. Don't stop. No matter what you hear, don't stop, she whispered, her voice trembling. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? Just promise me, she insisted, her eyes now filled with urgency. Promise. Okay, I promise, I said, though I had no idea what she was talking about. Moments later, I began to hear it, whispers, soft and indistinct, coming from the forest. They grew louder, more insistent, filling the car with an eerie presence. The woman beside me clutched her hands together, her knuckles white. Faster, she urged, her voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. I pressed down on the accelerator, my heart pounding. The whispers turned into murmurs, then into voices, all speaking in a language I couldn't understand. They seemed to swirl around the car, a chorus of disembodied entities trying to get inside. Through the fog, I saw figures standing among the trees, their eyes glowing in the darkness. The woman beside me started to cry, her fear palpable. Don't stop, she repeated, her voice a fragile thread of sound. I kept driving, the car tearing through the fog like a lifeline. The voices grew louder, almost deafening, and the figures moved closer, their shapes becoming more defined. I could see their hollow eyes and twisted forms. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, we broke through the fog and emerged into a small clearing. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. The woman let out a shaky breath. Thank you, she said, her voice filled with relief. You saved me. I looked at her, my mind reeling. What were they? Spirits of the forest, she replied, her eyes haunted. They try to lure travelers into the woods. Most don't make it out. As we reached the town, she asked me to drop her off at a small, old house on the outskirts. She got out, thanked me again, and disappeared into the night. I never drove through those woods again, and whenever I hear whispers in the wind, I remember that night. The night I narrowly escaped the clutches of the whispering woods. I was driving through the countryside late one night, trying to make it to my friend's cabin before dawn. The GPS indicated a shortcut through a rarely used back road, a narrow, winding path cutting through dense forest. I decided to take it, thinking it would save me time. Little did I know, it would be a decision I would regret. The road was dark, with tall trees arching over, blocking out the moonlight. My headlights barely penetrated the blackness, and I had to slow down to navigate the sharp turns. About 20 minutes in, I started to feel a growing unease, a sense that something wasn't right. I glanced at the GPS, but it had lost signal. I tried to retrace my steps in my mind, but the forest around me looked identical in every direction. Panic began to set in as I realized I was lost. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. The figure was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, staring at me with hollow eyes. He pointed down the road and mouthed something I couldn't hear. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window. "Are you lost?" I called out. He didn't respond, just continued pointing down the road. With no other options, I decided to follow his direction, hoping it would lead me out of the forest. I drove slowly, keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. The man was gone. The road twisted and turned, and I felt like I was driving in circles. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a light up ahead. Relief washed over me as I realized it was a small gas station. I pulled in, eager to ask for directions. The station was eerily quiet, the windows dark. I got out of the car and approached the door, but it was locked. I knocked, but there was no answer. As I turned to leave, I saw the man from the road standing by my car. "Hey!" I called out, but he disappeared around the corner of the building. I ran after him, desperate for help, but when I rounded the corner, he was gone. Frustrated and scared, I decided to get back in my car and keep driving. As I pulled out of the gas station, I saw a sign I hadn't noticed before. It read, "Welcome to Hawthorne, population 0." Chills ran down my spine. I had never heard of Hawthorne, and the sign looked ancient. I pressed on the accelerator, determined to get out of there as fast as possible. The road seemed unending, every turn looking the same as the last. Hours passed, and the sky began to lighten with the approach of dawn. Just when I thought I would never escape, I saw the main highway up ahead. I sped onto the highway, my heart pounding with relief. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time and saw the man standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. His hollow eyes followed me until I was out of sight. I finally reached my friend's cabin, exhausted and shaken. When I told him what happened, he paled and said that road had been closed for years due to strange occurrences. People who took it often went missing, and the town of Hawthorne had been abandoned for decades. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that unending road, but I know one thing for sure: I will never take shortcuts through the forest again. It was a stormy night, and I was driving back from a family reunion. The rain came down in sheets, making it nearly impossible to see the road ahead. I was tense, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. The weather report had warned of severe thunderstorms, but I had to get home. As I navigated the winding back roads, lightning lit up the sky, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. The wind howled, and the trees swayed dangerously close to the road. I was alone in the car, the sound of the rain pounding against the roof the only thing keeping me company. Suddenly, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt. It was a little girl, drenched and shivering, her hair plastered to her face. She looked no older than 7 or 8. I rolled down the window slightly. "Are you okay? What are you doing out here?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Please, can you take me home?" she pleaded, her eyes wide and terrified. My heart ached for her, and I couldn't leave her out in the storm. I unlocked the doors, and she climbed into the back seat, dripping water onto the upholstery. "Where do you live?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "Just down the road," she said, her voice a whisper. I started driving again, the rain showing no signs of letting up. The girl was silent, staring out the window. I tried to make small talk, but she only responded with nods or single words. Something about her seemed off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. After a few miles, she pointed to a small, dilapidated house at the end of a long driveway. "There," she said. I pulled in and turned to look at her. "Do you need me to walk you to the door?" She shook her head. "No, thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for the ride." She got out of the car and ran up to the house. I watched until she disappeared inside, then backed out and continued my journey home. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to drive back to the house to make sure the girl was okay. When I arrived, the house looked even worse in the daylight. The windows were boarded up, and the yard was overgrown with weeds. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I peeked through a gap in the boards and saw nothing but dust and cobwebs. My heart pounded as I realized the house was abandoned. I asked around in the nearest town, describing the girl I had seen. The locals exchanged uneasy glances before one old man spoke up. "You're not the first to see her," he said, his voice grave. "That girl died in a storm just like this one, many years ago. She was trying to get home, but she never made it." Chills ran down my spine. I had given a ride to a ghost, a child forever lost in the storm. To this day, whenever it rains, I can't help but think of that little girl, waiting for someone to take her home. I was on a long-haul drive across the state, transporting goods to a distant town. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through desolate fields and forests. It was the kind of road that seemed to go on forever, with no signs of civilization in sight. Night fell, and the darkness closed in around me. The only light came from my truck's headlights, casting long shadows that danced on the edge of my vision. The hum of the engine was a comforting constant, but the loneliness of the road was starting to get to me. I was about an hour away from the nearest rest stop when I saw a car pulled over on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. I slowed down and pulled over, figuring I could offer some assistance. As I approached, I saw a woman standing beside the car, her face illuminated by the flashing lights. "Do you need help?" I called out, stepping out of my truck. "Yes, thank you," she replied, her voice tinged with relief. "My car broke down, and I have no cell signal." I offered to give her a ride to the next town, and she gratefully accepted. She climbed into the passenger seat, and we continued down the highway. She introduced herself as Sarah, and we made small talk to pass the time. She seemed normal enough, but something about her story didn't quite add up. As we drove, I noticed she kept glancing at the rearview mirror, her expression tense. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to ease her obvious discomfort. "It's just, there's something you should know," she said hesitantly. "This highway is haunted." I chuckled, thinking she was trying to spook me. "Haunted, huh? By what?" "By a truck driver," she said, her voice serious. "He died in an accident on this road years ago, and now his ghost haunts the highway, looking for revenge. I raised an eyebrow. Revenge? For what? For being run off the road, she explained. He targets other drivers, trying to recreate his accident. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off as just a scary story. Well, let's hope we don't run into him, I said lightly. We drove in silence for a while, the darkness pressing in around us. Suddenly, the temperature in the truck dropped, and my breath fogged up in the cold air. I glanced at Sarah, and she looked terrified. "He's here," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Before I could react, the headlights of a truck appeared in my rearview mirror, barreling down on us at an alarming speed. I tried to accelerate, but my truck seemed to struggle, as if some unseen force was holding it back. The other truck swerved violently, and I fought to keep control of my own vehicle. Sarah screamed, and the air filled with the sound of screeching tires and blaring horns. Just when I thought we were going to crash, the phantom truck vanished, leaving us in the deafening silence of the night. I pulled over, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Sarah was sobbing, and I tried to comfort her, but I was shaken to my core. Eventually, we made it to the next town, and I dropped her off at a diner. She thanked me and disappeared into the night. I never saw her again. To this day, I can't explain what happened on that haunted highway. Every time I drive that route, I keep an eye on the rearview mirror, fearing the return of the vengeful ghost trucker. And every time I pass the spot where it happened, I say a silent prayer, hoping I'll make it through unscathed.